Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 10th episode of Conceptualism. I'm happy to have with me Christen Kong. She is a podcaster and she does a lot of work with community building, works for Mabel Arts, which is actually how we met for the first time at the Aga Khan Museum. And I'm so happy to have you here with us today. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
Yes, thank you, Afraz. I'm happy to be here.
And you're also a practicing visual artist, like you do drawings and paintings and things. Um, so I guess your artistic practice is multifaceted.
Yes, for sure. I love to use different forms of art, I guess, or art expression to um to kind of like take what's inside of me and put it out. So I love like the combination of audio work and visual arts,
Yes.
and yeah, I like how they collaborate together.
Well, you had a series about the Ramzan and Iftar where it was an animation with sound that you'd recorded in those workshops at the Aga Khan Museum. That was amazing. Um, who did you collaborate with? Who is the animator?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, so for virtual iftar night, a part of Maple Arts, we um, produced about 8 podcasts, and each podcast was paired with a shadow puppetry visual to go along with it. And our partners was Shadowland. And Shadowland, they're based downtown in the West End of Toronto, and they do amazing construction of puppets, but also shadow puppets. So it was, yeah, such an honor to have my audio with their shadow puppetry with birds and lanterns and people. So that, yeah, that was a really neat collaboration.
Yeah, it was beautiful. It was really amazing. And you were collaborating as well with Hussein Jan Muhammad, who is also facilitating the workshop and helping to capture some of the sounds. So,
Yes, exactly. He was the artistic.
can you hear me?
Yes, okay, I can hear you now.
So you were saying Hussein was the artistic director of the project.
Hmm. Yes, yes.
So that's our first introduction. Like that's how we met. And so then I reached out to you, and I asked about doing a collaboration where we would capture sounds, and I think the idea initially was to make a podcast about podcasting. That was that was kind of the initial idea, and it sort of evolved from there. Um so we've had a session where we've captured some sounds, um and yeah, like can you tell us about your practice of capturing sounds? Like what kind of concepts really inform that practice?
Yeah, for sure. So I started kind of audio recording in my third year of my undergrad. I had an ex-roommate who actually sold me my first portable audio recorder, and I didn't for many, many months, didn't use it for a long time until I had a this project actually at school to record interviews of Indigenous families that were being affected by an Alton gas company in Alberta who was polluting their river.
Huh.
And so it was my first time actually that I pulled out that recorder and I started recording people's stories. And I found myself every single evening staying up until like 5 o'clock in the morning, replaying all these narratives and playing with them, right? Editing out ums and coughs and elongating sounds. And yeah, I just had so much fun also recreating narratives out of the stories that I recorded. So then after that first project, I ended up going on and making 3 more podcasts that year. And that kind of was the beginning of my podcasting or story collecting journey. But it did start I was living up in Whitehorse for a little bit, and in Whitehorse, it is very isolating at times, especially during the winter. And what people do is they love to story tell. They love to gather and just to tell stories. And I remember this one man, he told a story all about running, his passion for running. And it just dawned on me, you really can talk about anything, anything that is meaningful to you, that is purposeful to you. So then so then on, I had this like great curiosity. What is meaningful to other people? So then, that's kind of how that also started too. And then I started like a storytelling collective in my third and fourth year, and I just gathered people to talk about different things. But then when I got hired by Maple Arts, I kind of still kept that storytelling within me, but then I explored sound through different noises, like ambient noises that we had at picnics. And what does it sound like to hear, the rustling of leaves or the wind or just children playing and screaming? And then I started to combine those kind of ambient natural sounds with curated stories and just making medleys out of them. And I love that. And I guess, Afraz, like your practice of kind of experimentation really interests me too. So what does it look like to gather sounds that are natural and reoccurring, and then curate them to put them on repeat or backwards, or make kind of like a new composition with it? So then, I guess like the virtual iftar nights, if you have a chance to listen to it, it's a mixture of many different sounds, actually across 2 years of just collecting sounds from the different programs that we had and then putting them all together in one place. And so I really love that too, is like these sounds that wouldn't have actually interacted with each other through technology and through editing systems, we have the magical capability of putting them together and making them interact in ways that we never thought could happen. And so now I think my practice definitely is still so embedded and grounded in story gathering and just listening to narratives that I like to seek myself, but then also combining that with sounds of nature that I hear in the everyday, right? And we also have to, something that is really important to me is listening and hearing local stories. What does that mean to tell a story in your local context? And so gathering sounds in my local context, really informs how I also hear the world around me. So I'm really excited to continue work like that. And then Afraz and I, we met up maybe like last month or something, and we started a new project on instruments and the characters of instruments. What do instruments look like if they were able to talk to you? And I'm really excited for that project actually.
Well, likewise, and we also recorded the sound of the waterfall, and we described the environment that we were in, cobblestones and trees and iron fences and things, and I think that's really interesting to create an image but with sound, like sound painting, if you will, you know
Yes.
and and this idea of combining sounds together, to me it kind of sounds like a virtual tapestry, or a sound tapestry, like where you're making this rug that has all these beautiful patterns that normally wouldn't interact together, but because you've woven them together, virtually or through technology, suddenly you have this beautiful new, medium which allows you to tell a story in a way that's never been done before.
Yes, yes, exactly. And that's kind of what draws me so much to audio, is that you don't have that visual component, that you actually allow the listener to fill in the illustration that they want from listening to what you have presented. And often, when I think about society now, we're such a visual culture. I mean, we've always been, right? Um, but even more so now with just, social media and people just representing themselves on these different platforms, but there's also so much judgment involved when we see something, right? That we maybe indirectly don't do or directly do. And so just having audio, you really can just listen to the person's voice without having to worry about what they look like, what they're wearing, you know, anything like that. And it really draws attention actually back to the voice more than, yeah, what that person may look like. So I really like that aspect. And yeah, I remember one of our outings, we went for a walk, and I love this memory. And I remember you heard some chimes like ringing and clinking in the wind, and then we stopped and we sat beside these chimes from this house that we were hearing it from, and then you started to play these singing bowls along with it. And I just thought that that was such a beautiful memory, because we were just listening to that, but then we added onto it as if we were making that, you know, a companion of some sorts that afternoon. So I really also, yeah, whenever I go for walks, I try to listen more than I see things around me. That's for sure.
That's beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a really important practice. I do that too. Like I do these sound walks, and I have this podcast called An Exploration of Noise, where I just go on walks and I just capture all the sounds, and sometimes I don't even edit them. I just release like a 3 hour or 4 hour track, which is just captured. Like it's just a snapshot of that space. And like I've done things like recording the sound of the air conditioning, or recording the sound of insects and birds, and just releasing these kinds of really ambient tracks. And I like to think of it, it's like kind of like reading, because when you're reading, you have the ability to make that picture or that film up in your head, whereas when you're watching a film, it's like you're being spoon-fed everything. The whole narrative is constructed for you, whereas with audio, or just purely audio, you have that leeway, that freedom, that kind of that ability to actually interpret and reinterpret the environment, the environment that's being created for you.
Yes, and just listening to you say that, right? Like we all will illustrate something different, and that speaks to our different past experiences,
Yes.
right? Like when I think about, for example, trauma, right? I know it's associated negatively, but trauma has people experience trauma because of certain triggers. And if they hear something, it can bring them back to that memory. So I guess in the same way, when we curate sound, or when we capture sound, it brings people back to different memories, and those memories are different for each and every one of us. So we can hear chimes, but those chimes can, you know, bring me back to, I don't know, listening to chimes that day. It might bring you, Afraz, back to another moment. So it's almost like sound is actually a portal, or a triggers to different memories that we used to have. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, like, like you said, we're a very visual culture. People depend so much on what they see. But like, what if you're visually impaired, or you're blind?
Mm-hmm.
Well, then sound and smell and touch, all these other senses are so important in recreating
Yeah.
an image of what the environment, or what the space you're inhabiting is. So I think sometimes it's interesting to rely on the other senses, the more neglected senses, to to create these spaces, you know
Yeah, exactly. And just off of creating spaces, not only do we travel back in time, we actually can create memories through sound, right? And I know one of our past conversations, we talked about hospitals, and how hospitals sometimes have these rooms of sounds of, like, you know, calming sounds or relaxing sounds. Or maybe you guys, you know, like listening to the trickling of water or wind, and that creates an environment for yourself in order to feel that calmness. And so I think, yeah, sound has that ability to create the atmosphere around you, even if you're not in that particular location.
right. Well, and I think we talked about hospitals. Actually, it was Brian Eno who made installations inside hospital rooms, where he would use light and sound in order to create like a calming space. And yeah, and I think that's a
Yes.
beautiful idea, and this idea of creating these kinds of installations is really appealing to me. And I actually think that the sounds that we collect through our podcast, or sound practice, I think those sounds could actually be used as an installation, whether it's in a park, or whether it's in a hospital, or whether it's in an airport, because I think I think these are spaces where people don't really think about sound, and they don't think about, how much sound affects us. And so to be able to
Mhm.
create these healing and safe spaces using sound is a really, like, it's something that really resonates with me, and it's something that I think both of us appreciate about the power of sound.
Yeah, yeah, completely. And I mean, I grew up in Toronto my whole life, and sound has definitely changed. I mean, with the onset of so much development, you have way more industrial sounds, right? Like with machines building new condos or buildings or suburbs. And that is noise pollution, right? Like environmentalism is such a huge topic these days, but we also, not only is it land that we're being polluted, or we're polluting, but we're also polluting noise
Wow.
and the sound around us. And what does that mean to like reclaim actually the lack of sound, right? Like one time, all I wanted to do was have silence. You just have those days where you just want quietness, and you can't get that in the city. You always have something running in the background, and it's only when you go out to like remote places or when the electricity stops that you actually finally hear silence.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I think silence is so important, as a way to um uh what's the word, uh dest uh destimulate
Yes.
our brains, because
Hmm.
we're always being stimulated by all these different sounds, and like to go back to like an uncluttered and a silent space is just so important. um
Yes.
you know and and it's interesting, like, even to have a quieter space, like when you're in nature you might hear the sound of the wind or the sound of the birds, but it's so much quieter than in the city, where you have all this, like you said, car noise, industrial noise, the sound of people around you. And all that sound, like you said, is sound pollution. And so, just like we're trying to, think about how to clean up the rivers and clean up the oceans and stuff, we also need to think about cleaning up the sound pollution, and like you said, reclaiming that space, you know and being
Yes.
more cognizant of the ways that space is affecting other people and affecting us.
Hmm. Yes, completely, completely. And, something that I've been learning recently too is like silence, or not complete silence, right? Like, I think silence looks different to many people,
Hmm.
but it allows us to reflect and it allows us to internalize ourselves. And I think that's something that is so important, to have that space, to have that um, lack of sound actually, to hear ourselves, because we don't hear ourselves a lot of the time.
Agreed.
Hmm.
Agreed. um and there are certain sounds that we associate with, you know with spirituality, I guess, like, for example, the Tibetan singing bowls or flutes or gongs even, you know um but
Hmm.
now, when I think about it, like, how do we reinterpret what kind of sounds are spiritual? Well, for Jimi Hendrix, who was playing the electric guitar and using distortion and feedback, that to him was a highly spiritual experience. Or Charlie Parker, who was playing a saxophone and making all these, squealing sounds with the saxophone, but to him that was an expression of his spiritual or his inner self. So, like you said, like, sound, it means so many things to so many different people. and and it's so fascinating to think about that, to ask people questions. What are the sounds that make up your life? Like, what are the sounds that remind you of things? What are the sounds that actually represent who you are?
Yes, yes, completely. And I think spirituality is such a good, actually, example of tying our identity and our meaning towards sound, right? Like when I think about myself, I attend church every Sunday, and one of my favorite things is in the morning we we play and sing music together, and it's a very communal thing that we do together. So not only sound is being produced by myself, I'm also doing it with other people. And I think a lot of spiritual sounds are actually very communal, and it brings people together, right? Yeah, and yeah, I just love that aspect of, yeah, of that. And yeah, it makes me want to, one thing I love doing too is like going into different spiritual sites, whether that's a temple or a mosque or a church or a meditation, space, and just listen to other sounds that other people hear when they're in a mode of spirituality or when they are in a space um, like that. So yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate, obviously, that COVID has closed a lot of these spaces, but when it opens back up, I would love to do, a survey even in Toronto of, of the sounds of like spirituality. That'd be really neat.
I think that's beautiful. Yeah, and I'd totally be down to do that, like together, like to like
Yeah.
ask people these questions, and maybe even capture their answers and like use that as a kind of in the same sort of vein as what we did, with the Maple Arts thing, where like you could even make like maybe an animation that like shows um like all the different the different answers, like somehow they're animated, like if somebody says that a pipe organ, is what reminds them of their spirituality, then like you have like a little animation
Mm-hmm.
of a pipe organ with like wind coming out of the pipes or something. I don't know, like like this kind of like interdisciplinary work where you take like these quote unquote raw moments, or this raw material, and you make it into something that's that's somehow like uh, a process based production, where it's not so much about the final result, it's more about the process that that
Mm-hmm.
that is in place in order to actually create a moment for somebody, or to
Yeah.
remind somebody of a moment.
Yeah, no, completely. And yeah, I'm glad that you brought up the idea of process, right? That we're a lot of, I mean, I'm generalizing, but we're so obsessed with outcome. We're so obsessed with results. But what does it mean to actually enjoy the process and find actually enjoyment in the process? And just thinking about sound and storytelling, it's all about the process. It's how you experience these things, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's such an important aspect. And
And
I think it makes it even stronger when you, especially through storytelling, when you live alongside someone and you hear and draw out their story after a long period of time. Think about that relationship that you built with that person. That actually in itself is more important than you extracting any story, is actually the relationship building of that process.
agreed, and it's a form of intimacy that most people don't really practice anymore,
Mm-hmm.
you
Yeah,
know
yeah,
and
exactly.
we were talking about how, like, in Western culture, it's so outcome based, but in Eastern cultures, and the non-Western cultures, the idea of everything being a process and there never being a real final product is actually the way that people live. Like, it's a
Mm.
different philosophy of life. People are not, oh, they're not quantifying success. They're not saying, oh, I made $10,000 today, that means I'm successful. It's more like, I had a beautiful moment today,
Yeah,
I'm successful.
yeah, exactly. And like, what would that look like, if people kept redefining moments, like moments as just success in itself? I think a lot of people would be de-stressed. I mean, when I think about it, I even feel de-stressed about that. So,
And it's
mhm.
it's funny because even in the education system, it's so results oriented. It's all about your grades, it's all about the tests and the exams and things. And it's like, what about learning for the sake of learning? What about learning for that kind of pure, that pure reason, which is just, I'm curious, like, following your curiosity and following your nose and going wherever you feel, like that to me is really a more interesting way of learning, or a more interesting way of educating yourself, than being judged based on what you remember because you crammed it the night before the exam.
Yes, completely, completely. Yeah, and I like that, you know, curiosity-led process. I think curiosity is such a term that is, yeah, so much involved in storytelling and capturing sound because you're trying to investigate, something that is interesting to you, and allowing yourself to lead by that, it opens up possibilities that actually you never thought you could go to, right? Like if you have a conversation, if I already had an expectation of this conversation, maybe I would have, not talked about certain things. So I think being led by each other and just that, um, yeah, questioning or like seeking of something more, it really does open up possibilities that you may not even imagine could have been there in the first place.
Well, I'm so happy that you said that because that's the reason that on this podcast I don't prepare questions. I don't go in expecting anything. I just kind of I let it develop and I let it happen. As it's going to happen. Because I think that way you have much deeper and much more intimate conversations. You know. So
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, and I mean, I'm not saying there's no place for a formal interview where you prepare questions, but I'm saying, to me personally, and since it's my podcast, I was like, you know what, I'm going to follow that my gut instinct, that if I allow for that freedom to to build these conversations in the moment, you know uh, to have these spontaneous compositions, then it'll turn out much more interesting than if I come with everything prepared.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's more space for experimentation. I think both of us are quite experimenters of sound, and just letting that flow and like, not being scared of taking risks. That's
Yeah.
another thing I've been realizing in my editing process is I've come a long way from like when I first began and now, is that I'm willing to actually take more risks and putting things together that, yeah, may not sound kind of that great, but just the experimentation of it, I've learned a lot, so yeah, there's so much risk involved, but it's actually worth it because yeah, again, it goes back to the process of what you learn out of it, but also in the end you create sounds that are like out of this world.
Exactly. And being comfortable, or being or being okay with uncertainty, I think that's so important, because everybody wants to control everything, and it's like, really, it's the things, like, human beings, at the end of the day, what do we want? We want to surrender, and the things that allow us to surrender. We were having this conversation, I think, on one of our walks, was that to surrender, like, to things like religion or sex, or even like music. Like, when you surrender, then you have this kind of awakening, where you realize, okay, you know what? It's not about me, and it's not about being in control. It's about the experience. You know,
Mhm,
and
mhm,
and so, yeah, I think human beings are always going, or trying to go towards surrender. But if you live in a big city, for example, and you're crossing the street and you surrender, and you just close your eyes, and you'll get run over by a car. So we have to be in control almost all the time, especially in a city. But I feel like creating spaces where people are allowed to surrender, like a monastery or a temple or a church, or even someone's backyard, where you feel safe, like lying in the grass and just watching the sky. Like those are the reasons that I think those are the reasons that we are alive. Nobody stays alive to pay their taxes. They stay alive, for the beauty, for the art, for the experience.
yes, yes, exactly, exactly. And I know I've told you this illustration before, but one of my good friends, Emily, she told me this illustration and it completely, yeah, like changed a lot of my perceptions about life. And she said that imagine you're holding beads this way with your hand this way, and you're holding the beads so tightly because you don't want them to let go. And if you open your hand, those beads are just going to fall to the ground. But she's like, what if you actually hold your hand this way and open your hand? Those beads will still stay there in your palm. And it's like this act, like what you're saying, surrendering like this, not like this, right? And so, what does that look like? What does that look like in your own life to actually be like this to a lot of things that you're trying to actually hold like this, And I just really, really appreciated that, yeah, my friend Emily shared that with me because
That's so
too
beautiful.
often we're holding on like this when we should be like this.
That's such a beautiful illustration. I think that's incredible. um and do you know where she got it from? Like, is this her own idea, or was this like an idea that she got from somewhere?
Yeah, you know what? I think she definitely was inspired. Um, she does meditation and she's a very good instructor of meditation. She wouldn't say she's a teacher, but she definitely guides people through meditation. So I think maybe along her learning in that, she was inspired by that illustration. Yeah.
It's beautiful. I love that so much. It's so profound. It's so simple, but it's so profound. And that's the thing.
Yeah.
It's like these things that are so simple that seem so obvious once you've articulated them. They're just the most profound things. And it's like, you know, it's the stuff that's right under your nose, the stuff that's that seems so evidently obvious once you've thought about it, but like before you thought about it, it's like, you know, how it seems obvious once it's known, but it's actually in that process of knowing that I think we come to these epiphanies, or these moments of of beauty, you know.
Yeah, for sure. And just something that popped into my mind is first times, right? Like that
Yeah,
when we get older, it's actually very I mean, it obviously depends on your life and who you are, but many things we have already experienced, right? And when I look at children, many things are actually their first time experiencing. And just like relating it back to sounds, I think sound is one of those things that you're actually hearing many sounds for the first time.
there's that new.
um, yeah, there's that newness and excitement to it. And I think that's why when you hear a new piece of music or your friend shares, they're like, oh, this song is so great, you should listen to it. It's exciting because it's your first time listening to it. Yeah.
And then there's also that idea, like that spiritual idea, that we actually know everything, but then, you know, then we've, by coming into the world, you know, we have this kind of amnesia where we forget everything, and then that's when we rediscover everything. There's that newness, and that, like, that's one of the rules of the game, you know, where you have to come as a blank slate, and then, you know, and then the painting is made, you know.
Yeah, and like what does it look like, for audio editors to like take sounds that are actually mundane or we think is mundane that we hear often, like yeah, like cars or you know, people bustling outside. Like I hear that outside of my window every single day, but it might be cool to like record that and then make a new sound out of that so that newness is brought back into things that we actually have heard for a very long time.
Yeah, the celebration of the mundane, or like, or yeah, or that reinterpretation. I think that's really important, you know. Like, for example, you know, I grew up in Tanzania, so like we would hear the azan, you know, the call to prayer,
Yes,
like, and I would hear that every day, and
yes,
you know, and so it became very mundane. But then when I, you know, when I came to Canada, or like when I went to India or whatever, or even France, and I was not hearing that every day, then suddenly it was like I missed it, because it was a part of my day. It was like I realized that was actually part of the landscape, that was part of the painting, that I took for granted because I'd heard it over and over again. But really, when I go back to Tanzania and I hear it, I smile, because it's like, there it is. You know, it's like a placeholder. It's a checkpoint.
yes, yes, exactly. And just to that, like I know you've traveled so many different places, and I know many people travel, um, or not, maybe not now, but like before, travel to so many places. And it's interesting to ask yourself, what sounds have been normalized in my life,
Yeah.
right? Like I remember
What has
also
gone
living in
wrong?
yes, yes, exactly. And it's like, yeah, exactly. What becomes actually part of your home or your sound of home, because you've been living in a place for a long time where at first it might have been unfamiliar, but then over time, yeah, it becomes, you make a place for it inside of yourself.
And you were saying you were in India.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say no. I was in Indonesia, and
Oh,
same.
Indonesia. Okay.
They have a yeah, like a huge Muslim population, and every morning we would hear the call to prayer. And at first, it would wake me up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I like sleeping in, so I was like, what is going on? But then after a while, you just yeah, you get used to it, and it actually becomes part of the sounds that you just hear every single day, and it becomes normalized after a while.
Yeah.
You know? Mm-hmm.
Well, it's kind of like color, like, you know, when you see shades of color that, you know, that you're not familiar with, and you look at it and you just dismiss it. Oh, it's pink. Like, what does it matter? But you realize there's so many in betweens. Like, there's so much space between the pink and the white. It's like with numbers, you know, like when we talk about infinity, you know, there's that idea that the space between 0 and 1 is a smaller infinity than the space between 0 and 2. And it's weird, because it's like there's so much there's so much there's so much gradation, but like you have to be really finely attuned to capture that, to realize, you know what, yeah, maybe I've heard horns a million times, but imagine you suddenly lived in the 1930s, the 1940s. Like, what would the horns sound like back then? So, like, imagine like you have a vintage car going down the street and you hear that horn. Then suddenly that sound is so strange and so unusual to you that it captures your attention, but only because that's not the norm anymore. Like, now
Mm-hmm.
horns all sound a certain way. So I'm always thinking about that. I'm always thinking about how sounds evolve, and how, like,
Yeah.
based on the context, based on like when you live, different sounds are normal to you, you know?
Yeah, I like that you brought up the evolution of sound. It makes me think of a baby and how when a baby is first born, they have like a newborn cry, and it's like very distinct. But then as they get older, their cry changes over time because the baby is changing. And yeah, you're so right. I think a lot of sounds evolve through time, uh, for sure. And just to the point that we like a question that I always think about is like how much attention am I giving certain sounds in my life, right? And I think it's the same, like whose voices are we giving attention to more than others? What sounds are we giving more attention to others? So yeah, just something interesting to, I guess, think about. Hmm.
And
Yeah.
you know I think the first like official collaboration that we did was Dogs in the Night. So can you tell us about Dogs in the Night?
Yeah, for sure. So, Dogs in the Night actually came from a time 2 years ago. I was living in South Africa, and in South Africa, many people have dogs, not as pets, but as kind of security purposes.
Right.
And I used to sleep at night, but then every evening at like 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all the dogs just would decide to have a conversation with each other, and they would bark for hours nonstop, and I could never get back to sleep. And then one night I decided to get my audio recorder, put it up against the window, and I started recording these dogs in the night. And they just kept going and going and going, and I just didn't know when they were going to stop having their conversation. And then at the time, I also lived with a younger brother named Josh. And in South Africa, they have this thing called load shedding, which is basically electricity is shared in different parts of the region. And so you may have days where you have no electricity for a couple of hours in the day. And I remember one time I was home alone with Josh and the power went out, and I don't like the darkness. So I told him, okay, let's do something. Like, let's keep ourselves occupied. And at the time, my family there had a piano in their living. He didn't have formal lessons, but he just knew how to play piano. So I said, and so we sat down at this piano, and he just started to play this piece, and I recorded him. And then
Kristen,
when I came
you cut
back to
out there.
Canada,
You
I
you
was
cut out there for a
re-listening.
second. You cut out there for a
Oh,
second. So
sorry. What part did I cut out?
okay. So there was a piano in the living room, and then the last thing I heard was that he had no formal training. So did you say anything in between that?
Okay, yes. Yeah, so he had no formal training, but he played this piano piece, and I just recorded him. And I don't think he knew I was recording him, but I did it secretly. And then when I came back
Okay, the best.
to Canada, I was re-listening to all my audio recordings that I had took. And then it dawned on me when I was re-listening to the Dogs in the Night, it didn't become annoying anymore because, I was in Canada, I could have a good night's rest without being woken up. And I was like, it kind of sounds like a metronome, it's kind of steady pacing. Even though it was irregular, it still sounded like a metronome. And then I heard Josh's piece, and I was like, you know what? The last time I used a metronome was when I was playing piano. So then I ended up whipping out my audio editing system. I put those two tracks in there and I played them together. And it was just so nice to hear, what if those dogs were a metronome to Josh's piano piece? And that's kind of how it formed. And then I sent it to our Fraz to listen to for enjoyment. And then he transformed it into something different by actually reversing it. And that was such an interesting experience too. And I never actually thought about doing that. So yeah, I actually really love that collaboration.
Thank you. Yeah, it was so much fun to do that. And you know, I wasn't like, when you sent it to me, I wasn't thinking I'm gonna do something to it. I just listened to it and I was like, this is so beautiful. And then, I was sleeping, about to go to sleep. You know that space that happens like when you're about to go to sleep but you're still slightly awake? And
Completely.
that's when I thought about it. I said, you know what? I wonder what this would sound like in reverse. And then I fell asleep. But thank God, when I woke up in the morning, I remembered that I had that thought. And so I got on my computer, I took the piece, I put it in my audio recording system, and I put it in reverse, like the way a record would spin in reverse. And then I sent it to you, and you liked it. And so, yeah, we released it as a collaboration. And I was like so happy, you know?
Yeah, yeah, and I do have to say I liked it because the dogs barking didn't become as annoying. It actually became quite soothing, going like reversing it for some reason. So that was a nice surprise.
So yeah, like you said, like these kinds of like reimagining these sounds that are like annoying or mundane or like abrasive, like suddenly this sound that was not very nice can become that can actually become, like you said, soothing or even calm or meditative, or have its own kind of surreal beauty, you know
Yes.
like there's this idea where like people will say, oh, this is ugly, or this piece of art is ugly, or this sound is harsh, or this sound is ugly. But then suddenly when you put it into a reimagined context, or even slightly
Mhm.
tweak it, then people are like, oh my god, that's beautiful, that's genius, that's brilliant. And you're like, well, hey, it's just about how you see it. It's like that perspective, you
Yeah.
know it's like,
Yes. Yeah, completely. And like maybe looking back now that you're saying that, maybe I was annoyed at these dogs because I was trying to sleep. Like it was so contextual. And then when I came here, I was listening to it at a moment that I wasn't trying to sleep. So it didn't become as annoying, right? So yeah, it definitely is when you were listening to a sound, it really changes how you hear it.
yeah, definitely. And speaking of spaces and context, um, we did a recording in the Aga Khan Museum's courtyard, with the
Yes.
singing, the flute, and the singing bowls. And there's a 9 second or 10 second echo in there, in that space.
Mhm.
And that day there was a lot of wind, so the echo was reduced very significantly. Um,
Mhm.
and so that's a perfect example of how like the space in a way dictates the recording, because
Yeah.
we went in thinking, oh, we'll have 10 seconds of echo, and suddenly it's reduced to like 3 or 4 seconds because there's so much wind, you know
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
so like if we went on a really calm day, then suddenly the aesthetic of the recording that we captured would be totally different.
Yeah, completely. And I mean, when I think about interviews, right? Like the number one thing that interviewers look for is a a quiet space where you don't hear any other sounds. So we actually curate a lot of the spaces that we want to hear certain sounds for sure. And it's so different, finding a quiet room to do an interview versus doing interview in the field, like at a park or outside downtown. It
Yeah,
really adds to it adds to the story in a different way as well.
I
Mhm.
agree. I agree. And you do this. You do field recording. I also practice with field recording. And I think the idea of field recording is really interesting because like a studio is a perfectly controlled space, whereas a field recording, you know, you're just totally not in control.
It's
You're just
uncontrollable.
right. And
Yeah.
so like there's such a different aesthetic, and it's like it's I mean, it's quite beautiful because you're capturing whatever happens in the space. It's a
Mhm.
there's a kind of authenticity to it, which you sometimes can't capture in an extremely controlled space like a studio, where
Yeah.
the recording might end up seeming a little bit contrived, or a little bit too in control, you know
Yeah, yeah. And I think, what you're speaking to, it's something that I've actually struggled with a lot. I love very crisp and clear sounds, and I try to record that way as well.
yeah,
But the more that I hear um, less crisp sounds, I kind of like it, right? Like we did some interviews over the phone and it was kind of scratchy sounding, the texture wasn't quite right. But then when I listened to it, I was like, oh, it's actually kind of raw. Like it's kind of a nice sound that we did actually just call someone and have an interview. I shouldn't try so hard to cover that up that it was a phone interview, you know? So kind of sitting with that imperfection is something for sure I've had to let go of over the, yeah, when I audio edit. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's quite interesting because like I guess I mean I don't know if you consider yourself an audiophile, but I definitely consider myself an audiophile. And so I've just been asking myself, what does that mean? Like, what does it mean to be obsessed with sound quality? And I realized actually, you know what? I love lo-fi and grainy and gritty recording just as much as I like a beautiful crisp recording with like $10,000 microphones. Like
Yeah, yeah,
both
totally.
aesthetics have their merits and they have their place, and
Mm-hmm.
so like there's some people who'll say oh I only want to use a ribbon microphone on this recording, and I'm like, well, that's good for you, but like I'm not just interested in using this one way. Like, I'm interested in everything. I'm even interested in the recordings that are made on a phone with just like the crappy little
Yeah.
mic on the phone, because like you never know, like like every different little bit of technology forces you to be creative, and to see things in a particular way that you might not have that first imagined or first conceptualized. And to give you an example, this keyboard behind me only uses floppy disks. And as you know, floppy disks have a very tiny amount of memory. I think the biggest one is maybe like 10 megabytes. So I have a whole box of floppy disk. I call it my floppy disk orchestra, that's filled with all these little ideas that I would have never thought to capture if I didn't have that limitation. Because on my
Mm-hmm.
computer I can basically record forever. Like I have not an unlimited amount of space, but it feels like that. It feels like I have so much space, like I can do whatever I want. Whereas like having a limitation, like a floppy disk, actually forces you to really question, to ask, what's the most important part of the sound? Like, how can I distill the essence of the sound, in within this limited medium or this limited context?
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that example. And it just reminds me of this quote. I don't know if I'm going to quote it right, but basically it goes like, limitations actually help us to be more creative. So we think as, artists that, oh, like boundaries and rules and limitations actually suppress our creativity, but that's actually not true. Sometimes when you put limitations on our work, we have to find more ways actually to be resourceful and creative. So yeah, I just like that idea of limitations actually enhancing creativity and like innovation actually.
I agree with you 100%. Like, if we didn't have anything to push against, if we didn't have any boundaries, or we didn't have that, if we didn't have any edges, then suddenly there would be nothing like newness. There would be nothing like discovering new territory, or there would not be that frontier. So
Yeah.
there always has to be some sort of edge or some sort of boundary, which then allows us to push against it. And that friction is, like you said, what creates, or like, if you didn't have friction, you wouldn't have fire. you know
Mm-hmm.
so so
Yeah, that's right.
so
That's right.
we need that friction. We need that's how the heat is generated you know
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, completely. And it's like through challenges, like I think whenever we produce something, we are met with many different challenges that we have to troubleshoot or overcome or think of a way to make it work. When you're on a tight deadline doing an audio piece, you can't just not do it. You have to try to find a way to make it work, make those sounds work and mold together somehow. And so it really pushes a lot of boundaries. I know that's something that when I, have to create an audio piece the for the company that I work with now, it's like you just have to make a way, you know.
well, one of
Mm-hmm.
my favorite writers, Douglas Adams, who wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, he had a really funny quote where he said, I love the sound of I love deadlines. I love the sound of them whooshing by. you know. And
Yeah.
so like there's these really hilarious stories where, you know, his agent or his publishers would lock him in a hotel room and say, you've got to get this done. You know, like they would basically lock him in a room and sit with him and say, get this done. And you know, they
Mhm.
said, you know, if it was literally any other author, we couldn't have done that because they're not as pleasant company, they're not as bearable. Whereas like if you're hanging out with Douglas Adams, then, you know, it's like it's always like really funny and really, you know, engaging and inspiring. And so, you know, it's quite interesting that actually creative people, you know, having deadlines is a kind of there's a kind of like space that happens where there's a deadline and you're like, I have to finish it, I have to get this done by this date, you know. And then if you don't get it done by this date, then there's, you know, there's these consequences. So it's like, but at the end of the day, like, you know, even if you do have a deadline, it's never like the work is finished. I'm sure you realize this, like, you know, all these pieces that you've made, when you go back and you look at them, you're like, you know, I could have done
Yeah.
this differently, or I could have done this better. So, you know,
Mhm.
what I say is, if you think that, go ahead and make it happen. You know, like
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
like take these things that are quote unquote finished, and and you know, open that box up again, you know, and go back to that playground and play with the sand again and see what happens. But then there's
Yeah.
also this idea, like, where like you have to know when something is finished and to like let it go and to say, you know what,
Yeah. Yes.
like, this is done, this is like,
Yeah.
it's
It's
beautiful.
enough. It's enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I really resonate with that. Just like knowing what to let go of and what to actually continue. And like we were saying before, at different moments in our life, we, even if we hear the same sound, or even if we listen to the same sound, we hear it differently, right? So even if you finished a piece a year ago, you come back to it, you may want to like, yeah, like replay with it. I like that idea, actually. Yeah.
And it seems that you like fairy lights.
I do like fairy lights. Honestly, I definitely want to get more in my room and put them all over my ceiling. They remind me of nice stars, so I like them.
That's really cool. Yeah, I really like fairy lights too, and like, whenever you see them, that it always indicates that it's a celebration of some kind, you know. So
Yeah.
like they create this, like, this happy space, you know, like
Yes.
like
Yeah, completely.
like in our in like at in the Ismaili tradition, like whenever it's like a big day or a celebration, we always have these lights up on the mosque, you know. And so like, you know, so I whenever I see the lights, I'm like, oh, it's a celebration, it's a big day, you know, it's a festive occasion. So like having them in my room would be so cool, because it's like every day is a celebration, you know, every day is like a
Yes.
big day, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree with that.
And you know, I really like this idea of being a curator of a space, you know, like where you know, you're making the space that you want to exist in. And like, I think we can also do that with sound, because we make these spaces that we want to exist in. Like, you know, when we're listening to these wind chimes and the wind, and you know, and sitting in the grass, like, now whenever I hear wind chimes, it takes me back to that beautiful moment. And so like, we were the curators of the space, but we were also the inhabitants of that space. Like,
Hmm.
like, for that brief moment in time, like, that was our space and we were holding a
Yeah.
space, you know.
Yeah.
And I really like that idea of like being a curator, but then also being like I don't know what the right word is, but like,
Yeah, like resting or
yeah,
living into a space.
yes, exactly, exactly. Like, yeah,
Hmm.
allowing yourself to be in a space, you know, that kind of that ability to like to say, yeah, this is to embrace the space.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and it just goes, right? It goes back to like what you were saying about surrendering. It's like there are some spaces where we have no control over the sound, but all we do have control is if we want to enter into it or not,
Yes,
right?
or stay in it or
Yeah.
not.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, or stay in it or not. Exactly. Exactly.
And I
Yeah.
mean,
Hmm.
nature has so many beautiful sound installations, like the sound of waves, you know, at the ocean. Like, that's a beautiful example of an aleatoric composition because it's completely chance based. There's no real order or pattern. But then when suddenly when you look closely, the ocean could suddenly be like the world's biggest metronome.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think one of my favorite things about like natural sound or spaces is that it's repetitive, and I really love repetitive things because you really, yeah, can focus on it or it sounds differently when it's repeated many times. It's almost like those images where you see one, like what is it? It's you see like one blade of grass, but when you see like thousands of blades of grasses, like it changes how you see it. So
Yes.
anyways, in the same way, it's like one sound versus repetitive thousands of sounds of the same sound changes how you see it. But anyways, point is, that's why, maybe that's why a lot of people love the sound of rain or love the sound of waves, because it's calming in that way, because it's just over and over and over again. So you can really, yeah, meditate on that one thing, instead of allowing your brain to like, go wild and yeah, just like think about too many thoughts, I guess. Mm-hmm.
Well, and Brian Eno had a little like quote, which was that repetition is a form of change, and I thought that was so beautiful.
Yeah. Yes, 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 exactly. That's exactly it, right? And I like how nature actually just repeats itself without us having to repeat it, right? It's like I can take a sound and I can repeat it over and over again on my editing system, but nature is just like, nope, I don't need that. I just do it myself.
I was gonna ask you, did you have a chance to look up moire patterns?
No, I haven't yet. I haven't yet, but I will, but it sounds like they're repetitive patterns.
Well, they're actually, it's when you juxtapose a pattern like where, like, let's say you have a bunch of lines going diagonally, and then you have another set of lines going diagonally, but you change the angle slightly, and suddenly you have this juxtaposition of like,
Okay.
you know and so I've always loved creating moire patterns with sound, where like you have a bunch of sounds, like, or maybe like say a rhythm, and then suddenly you put a whole nother set of sounds on top of it, but you change it slightly, like let's say you delay it by half a
Okay.
second, and then suddenly you have a moire pattern with sound.
Ooh, I really like that. Ooh, which reminds me, something that Hussein did during our Aga Khan workshops is, do you remember he had paper and he drew different lines on it, and we had to sing or say or make a sound that followed that illustration. It
Yeah.
kind of reminds me of that. It's like how do visuals inform the ways we make sound, but also the other way around.
Totally. And that brings me to like
Yeah.
graphic scores, or like the idea, like, there's this beautiful there's a artist called Mark Applebaum, and one of the things he did was he made this giant graphic score, and I'll send it to you. It's like
Yeah.
a giant graphic score that was at a
Okay.
museum, and like I think it was every Friday from like 12 to like 1, musicians would come into the museum, and they would interpret this graphic score that was an installation at the museum. So like suddenly would come to life, and like you would see like 5 musicians or 10 musicians all making sound together, interpreting this graphic score. And like, so I've always loved graphic scores, and I thought Hussein's use of them was amazing at that workshop.
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow, that sounds like an amazing project. Please, yeah, please send it to me.
I will. I totally will. And that's the other thing. Like, when you think about like an album cover, or like for example, like, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, like if you look at that album cover, like it's so weird because on one hand it tells you exactly what it is, and on the other hand it's so abstract, like it could be anything.
Yeah,
Like i
yeah.
love i love that ambiguity. Actually, I love ambiguity so much. I love when things are ambiguous, when things are not like really well defined, like when there's all this space for saying, you know what, it could be this and it could be that, and it
Yeah.
might, it's like, and that ability to like shape shift, I think is so beautiful.
Hmm.
And the
Yes.
moon, well, yeah, the moon does this all the time, because like, when you have all the different phases of the moon, the waning moon, the waxing moon, and it's like, and it's like, it's so ambiguous because like, you know it's you you can't really capture it, but then it you know, that effect of seeing the moon in all these different illuminated stages, and it constantly repeating itself,
Yeah.
it's like it's constantly shape shifting. And then also the moon affects the tides, so you know, like the gravitational pull of the moon affects the tides. And so it's like, you know what, that's nature's installation, where, you know, gravity, the pull of gravity is actually affecting waves. And so it's like, depending on the way the tide is, the waves are going to sound different. So to me, that kind of ambiguity or that shape shifting, even in nature, is so appealing. Like even the idea of like a black hole, like you can't see a black hole. You know, you can only know that it's there based on the way that that space is curving around it, and the way that it's affecting things.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, yeah,
so
that's
like,
right. And yeah, go ahead.
and I was gonna say, like even our relationships are so ambiguous. Like you know, and we're constantly trying to define them and put them in a box, but at the end of the day, like they're always ambiguous, and I love that. You know, I love that
Mhm.
so much.
Yeah, and just to talk about the moon, I also really love the moon. But something that came to mind just right now is how the moon is so mysterious that it chooses, or I don't know if it chooses, but it chooses to hide itself, right? That's why we have like the different phases of the moon.
Yeah,
And it just makes me think like if you have that same thought for people or other things, it's like what is hidden? What is hidden and what is being revealed at certain moments in time. And that actually at that moment that when we look up at the sky, we think that, if what if someone didn't know that the moon was actually round? They might think that the moon was actually only that sliver, but then every day it like becomes revealed and revealed and revealed until it's the full moon. So in the same way, how much of ourselves are we hiding until we reveal fully, or we may never even get there either,
and
right?
and it's quite interesting that you bring this up, because that brings about the point that there can only be revelation if there is something that's hidden.
Mm, yeah, I like that. I
And
like that.
there can only be a mystery if you don't know everything.
Yeah, and I think mystery is such an important part of life, actually, that I think humans are too obsessed with knowing everything that it takes away the mystery. But really, I think life was created in order for us to live in mystery so that we have to come to terms with accepting the fact that we won't know all the answers.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think so. I think so. And really knowing everything would actually get kind of boring. I think that's why
Yeah.
that's why we play this game where we don't know everything, and we have that ability, that chance to go into the mystery, to go into the hidden, you know, to go into the abstract. And that's why I think abstract art is so beautiful, is because, you know, it's not trying to tell you what it is. It's, you know, it's just kind of, it's saying, you know what? It could be anything you want. It's a mystery. And so, like, if you see this abstract painting and the artist never told you, you know, what it's about, it was left untitled, you know. Oh, by the way, that reminds me, like, you know, when we went and saw the rugs at the Aga Khan Museum,
Yeah.
a lot of them were untitled, and I thought
Yes, that's right.
that was so great. Like, that was so cool, because like that gave the viewers so much more freedom, and like that mystery was so attractive, so appealing, you know, as
Mm-hmm.
both as a viewer, and I'm sure even as an artist, the freedom to let it be a mystery, to not have to define it.
Yeah, yeah, and just naming, right? Like naming something. Um, yeah, it does. I think there's a lot of associations with names, and names are important. But yeah, I think not naming something doesn't define it. So then it has that freedom to, yeah, maybe not be confined in that definition that the name gives.
Right. And like it allows it to exist in a kind of gray area, in like a, you know, in a space which is, you know, it's not so black and white anymore. It's suddenly all gray. and
Yeah.
and actually, you know, I think like having the you know, like actually being undefined in a way kind of defines it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. That's actually so true. That's very so true. That's true.
So like, and I love paradoxes. I love a good paradox. Like, you know, as much, you know, as much as I like ambiguity and mystery, I love paradoxes, because, you know, there's these juxtapositions of things that coexist, and it's suddenly like, you know, it's this but it's also that, and you're like, how could these two coexist? And they do. And it surprises us, and it inspires us, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of like emotions, right? Like you can't just feel one emotion at a time. You actually feel many emotions at a time,
Yeah,
and they can exist together.
yeah.
hmm Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I'm feeling really inspired by it, and and I can't wait to see where our collaborations lead us, because so far um they've really given me a lot to think about, and a lot to be hopeful for.
Yes, same here. I know I'm really looking forward to taking more risks and experimenting and just seeing what both of our kind of practices look like combined. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.